All right, welcome everyone. We're excited to have you here today. My name is Catalina Coleman. I'm the Director of HR and Inclusion here at Built In, and my pronouns are she, her. I've been with Built In for almost 3 years, but thanks to a growing HR team, I've been able to be more intentional about our internal DEI work, an area I'm incredibly passionate about over the past year. Some of the work we've done internally is launch ERGs, conduct equity and inclusion audits, and build an internal DEI roadmap with metrics. But like many others on this call, I'm sure, recognize there's still a ton of work to do, which is why I'm really excited to learn more best practices from our panelists today. A little bit about Built In first. At Built In, we help more than 1,800 companies of all sizes activate sought after talent. We tell compelling brand stories that capture the interest of in-demand talent. More than 2.5 professionals visit our site monthly. That includes engineers, data scientists, ops, product professionals, as well as tech adjacent roles like sales and marketing. Just a quick note of housekeeping. Please know that if you do have questions, you can add them in the Q&A feature and we'll try to get back to them. We're also going to send a recording of this webinar so you can refer back as well. So, in the context of the short webinar, we will not be able to discuss issues pertaining to all people affected by discrimination, as our time is limited, and it's a big, hefty topic. However, we will be talking today about many underrepresented employees in tech, including but not limited to this list. We'll also use a term BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, a term that may be imperfect but is designed to be inclusive. While DEI has been a topic of discussion for years, the social unrest of 2020 has inspired a groundswell of dialogue and a fair amount of reckoning around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're not there yet, but many companies understand that they won't thrive if they sideline DEI. This month, we've published Built-in's data on the topic of DEI in tech. We conducted 2 DEI surveys in September and October of 2020 and geared to one of 2 groups, tech professionals and tech employers. As you'll see in the release report, our survey data shows a 2-edged sword. To understate the case, tech is not an shining example of DEI. However, some data supports the fact that companies have begun to acknowledge shortcomings and are taking steps to create change. I'll share just a few of the report's highlights on the state of DEI in tech currently. Nearly half of the surveyed users identified as white. Almost half of the tech companies say they have more than 60% male employees. For 75% of surveyed companies, less than 10% of employees are Black. The majority of companies have no Black leaders and no Hispanic Latinx leaders. Practically all companies have no Native or Indigenous leaders. Overall, there is little in sexual orientation and negligible representation among non-binary and non-cisgender individuals. In addition, ageism is so rampant, and so is discrimination. So that's a hard pill to swallow. I'm glad to say we did find areas of progress. In 2020, the tech industry has placed notably more emphasis on DEI. The percentage of companies that invested in DEI jumped from 75 to 86% in 2020. So that's an 11% increase. Almost half of employees say they've noticed this uptick. In 2020, companies are bringing on more dedicated DEI staff. They're putting in place DEI policies and manifestos, and they are more committed to measuring DEI. Just as important as well to share that data. So for all of those layered reasons, we've invited this panel to gain some insights. I'd like to welcome and thank these experts for joining us today. We'll go ahead and jump in and do introductions. Let's start with Amaya. Please give us your background, your role, where it sits in the organization. Tell us a little bit about yourself. And in addition, we want to know how you define DEI.
Sorry about that. I forgot I have to unmute myself to have you hear me first. Hi, everybody. My name is Amaya Arua-Barana. I'm the Senior Manager of Diversity and Equity Inclusion for ezCater. I have a bit of an interesting background. I'm actually originally from Las Vegas and started off in a different career. I was headed towards going the pre-med route, but have been passionate about equity in my personal life for many years. So I kind of made my way to Boston, thought I was still going to go the medical route, decided not to, and through turning over every stone and tripping and tumbling into this role, I found myself doing DEI work, and incredibly passionate about it and excited because I had no clue that this was actually a job that could be done. So now that I know that, I am really happy to be a part of this world and doing this work at easycater, and getting to chat with wonderful people like on this call. So how do I define diversity, equity, and inclusion? I define that as looking at this as a holistic process, right? So looking at that we are actually accessing 100% of the talent pool, bringing in all different experiences into the company, not looking for just culture fit, but culture adds who can bring their own unique experience and make us better. So making sure we have equitable processes that exist in order to bring 100% of the talent pool into the company. Then once the people are here, they have equitable access to succeeding, to being able to be promoted, to feel acknowledged, feeling that they can bring their whole selves to work, and that they're set up for success. That to me is really what it looks like to have diversity, equity, and inclusion exist at an organization. Every step of the process from outreach to employee exit.
Thank you. I'd like to pass it over to Shantae as well. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your background and your role, where it sits in the organization, and how you define DEI.
Thank you, Catalina. It's so nice to be here today with the panel, with everyone. So my name is Shantae Butler. I am head of diversity and inclusion at Flatiron Health. My pronouns are she and her as well. So Flatiron Health, for those who don't know, is a technology company where our mission is to improve lives by learning from the experiences of every cancer patient. I've been at Flatiron for 4 years. In April, it'll be 4 years, but I have been in the head of D&I role for 4 months. So prior to taking on the head of D&I role, I worked on our quality team where I interface with product and engineering. So it's really exciting and interesting to come from the business side to the D&I HR side. So at Flatiron, D&I does sit within HR with a dotted line to our Chief Executive Officer. So it's really nice to have both the support and in line and partnership with our other people team leaders and experts, but then also to have advocacy and support from our CEO as well. So at Flatiron, for D&I, as we talk about D&I, it's important to have all three, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can't have one without the other, or both or two without the other, without one. So for us, it really is about having a sense of belonging for our employees. And in order to achieve that, like Amaya was saying, you need diversity, equity, and inclusion along your whole life cycle of being an employee at Flatiron. So really excited to be here today and to share more with the other panelists.
Great, Sandra, next question for you. Tell us about where you are in your organization, the background in your role, and how you define DEI.
Sure. I'm Sandra Gittens-Otley. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I lead diversity and inclusion at Asana, which is a work management platform that allows teams to work together better. For us, as everyone has said, diversity and inclusion really is about ensuring that you're really creating an environment where everyone can do their best work and do their job well, living up to their full potential. So I really think of diversity as being able to identify and recognize and welcome folks with different identities. We may talk about it in terms of race or gender or sexual orientation, but it encompasses so many different facets of ourselves. And inclusion is really about ensuring that all of those perspectives that all of these people with different identities can bring, then those perspectives are valued and welcomed and heard. And belonging is that sort of sweet spot, right? It's that part where you're able to engage the full potential of everyone so that people can thrive and do their best work. Equity is about really looking and honing in on the tools and processes that both identify as well as specifically address inequalities that have existed because of systemic reasons, and really ensuring that those things are dealt with and dealt with effectively, particularly in an organization. My role sits within, similar to Shantae's, sits within the HR team, or people team as we call it. And that's because we thought of it as really ensuring, because I own company-wide belonging and inclusion initiatives, trainings, global diversity initiatives. Being within the people team allows that sort of partnership and execution within the people org. But I also work really closely with our leadership teams to ensure and to allow them to be able to advocate and support the work that we're doing. So it's not, people tend to think of D&I, if placed in an HR organization or in any organization, that it's siloed. It's not. It's an opportunity to really be connected throughout the organization.
Thank you. Sancha, I'm going to take it back to you again. We found that 78% of professionals we surveyed think DEI is very important when considering an opportunity. And 88% of Black candidates feel this way too. So more pronounced, when we look at that. What are you doing to ensure that candidates understand, how you're prioritizing DEI?
I think it's great that so many BIPOC candidates are asking for that, are valuing that. And it acknowledges two things. One, that BIPOC candidates, this is something that is core to their identity. They want to go to a place where they know that they are valued, and they also know that they have a choice, and they can choose to go to places that value that. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is something that candidates are recognizing. For us at Asana, we are really about ensuring that you're not just talking about it and saying that this is something that you do, but that you have actions that show that work. And we do that in a couple of ways. Some ways are visible to candidates, whether it's in terms of asking for pronouns or encouraging people to share their pronouns, or having an inclusive hiring process. But I also think it's important for, and we talk about it, but for candidates to know about the things that are happening that are not necessarily visible to them in their process. So for example, we do trainings for managers, for hiring managers, as well as for interviewers. So for anyone who's involved in the hiring process on bias, because we think that bias is one of the foundational things that you need to be addressing. Bias training, to be clear, does not solve all the things, but certainly understanding and being clear on ways to mitigate bias is a way to start that work. We do trainings with our managers around inclusive leadership, around managing teams inclusively. We have processes that look at the interviewing policies that we have. So for example, we have a policy called ideal interviewing, which is similar to the Rooney Rule approach in some companies, and really is ensuring, again, that we're not evaluating candidates on a checklist. We are evaluating candidates, and we're not trying to fill roles until we have ensured that we have indeed diversified our pipeline. One of the other things that we do that kind of highlight our D&I commitment to candidates, we invite our candidates to the events that we have, talking about diversity and inclusion, just so that they know that it does not stop at the process, it's ongoing. And we offer to our candidates to talk to someone, not me, talk to an employee who is a member of their community or community that they feel most connected with. From our employee resource groups, it allows them to ask really direct and honest questions, and we encourage our employees who are participating in that to be open and authentic and share what is actually going on in the organization, because we think that doing this allows our candidates to really get a full picture of what it's like at Asana.
Thank you so much. I want to pass it over next to Amaya. You alluded to this in your introduction, and I think Sancha touched on it a little bit as well. The idea of culture fit or the perfect candidate can be problematic in the context of discriminatory hiring. Why do you think that is, and how should we think instead?
I think so often we look at diversity and think, oh, we're looking at diverse gender, diverse race, diverse sexual orientation, insert, all the different identities that we are all comprised of. And we forget that we're really looking at diversity of experience and diversity of thought as well. And so often we'll think, oh, we're looking for a culture fit. We want somebody who, we think that that's the right way to go about finding people who we think will contribute and help the organization grow, instead of looking at it as, how can we be better? What don't we know? How can somebody external come with this different experience, this different way of thinking about things, and make us better by adding to that? And so even just tweaking that one word from fit to add, I mean, if you just think, what do you think about when you think fit? You think, okay, I have this mold and I want somebody who's going to fit into that. Versus if I'm thinking add, I'm thinking of somebody who is going to bring something different to us that we are possibly missing, and we can be better because of it. And I think that's also where a lot of bias can creep in to hiring, right? So we love ourselves. We all like to think that we are the best and we know everything and we do things the right way. And so it's human nature, right? So when we're interviewing people and somebody is kind of repeating back to us what we agree with or a way that we think, we're like, yeah, that sounds, you agree with me. We think the same way. This is awesome. Not realizing that we are unconsciously being biased and not saying, hey, why do I like that you are saying that? Why do I like that that was your answer to that? How can we look at this a different way possibly? Or you reached this conclusion in a way that I wouldn't have, but I really like how you approach that. I wouldn't have done that had I not heard it from you. And just shifting into that open mindset of maybe we're not the most perfect, maybe we don't have everything figured out or do everything the right way, and look at it as, it's great to bring people into the organization who can make us better, who look at things differently, who offer that diverse experience to help us grow and be better as a company.
Thank you. Shante, so 60% of tech candidates look for data on DEI when researching companies. Clearly, the reporting part of DEI is critical. What are you doing to measure, report, and share? And aside from the fact that candidates look for this info, why is the reporting so important?
Sorry about that. Yes, thank you. And I just one thing to add on to what Amaya and Sondra was saying in the previous question. For us about that culture fit question, also our recruiting team and our HRBPs have really done a great job of coming back to us as the business and saying, and helping us define, what do we really mean when we say culture fit? Because it's not just about but what does that actually mean? Someone who's innovative. We believe in innovation. We believe in the space to be creative. So really defining like, what does that mean? And being very clear on that has helped us as we look at our interview process as well. So I just wanted to add that. But thank you, Catalina, to your specific question. So at Flatiron, we've always tried to be accountable to our employees first, right? So sharing our metrics internally has been our priority. So as I've transitioned to this role, discussing and seeing if it's right for us and the right time to share our metrics externally is something that's ongoing for us. As we're in our D&I journey and ever evolving, right? It's really important to be accountable to our employees first. I am a firm believer of, it's great to put these things out externally, but what are you really doing internally to support your employees, to ensure that you're having retention, to ensure that you're meeting your goals on representation and doing the things that will help you do that in terms of recruiting. For us, reporting helps to hold us accountable, right? Accountable to our employees and to ourselves. And it also helps us to really provide transparency to our employees and show our commitment through our data. And also being able to track our progress, being able to track where we need to shift, where we need to pivot, where we need to put more resources. And I think it's important as you go on your D&I journey, like those metrics are going to change, how you report are going to change, but I think trying to get some consistency on reporting is kind of the phase that we're at with our employees, and really being able to use data to drive our program and to drive our decisions and really anchoring to our data. It's an ever evolving process, but that is how we're really trying to focus our D&I program to really be data driven and data responsive to ensure that we're doing the best for our employees and doing the best for Flatiron as a whole.
I love that. Thank you, Shante. Sanja, did you have anything to add there as well?
Yeah, I +1 to everything you said, Shante. One of the things that happens around diversity and inclusion is that people start to think that it's a feel-good thing. It is, but unless and until you are actually measuring the work that you're doing and being really strategic and intentional about it, you're not really aware both the value that it's bringing, but also what needs to be changed, what needs to be done. So I love how you've kind of reinforced that. It's an approach that we have as well, because I do think that once you start to treat it like you do any sort of business strategy that will benefit your organization, you must take into account what the data is saying, what the data is showing, and really being able to be accountable for the goals that you set to your internal stakeholders, as well as participating within the wider industry discussion, which allows us to really make a bigger change to the entire tech ecosystem, which I think is so important for all of us to be doing. Unless and until we are being really transparent and visible about that, we just don't know where we are and also how far we have to go.
Thank you. I want to shift a little bit from recruiting to retention and the employee experience. So Amaya, this question is for you. Presenting employees with the same opportunity is not equity, it's equality. Equity closes gaps and provides each person with tools they individually need to succeed. How can we ensure that marginalized groups experience equity and not just equality?
Absolutely. So I think what's super important here is recognizing that the gaps exist. So I think what happens a lot of times with companies is they're, wake up to DEI and say, okay, hey, we need to start implementing these processes. We need to make sure we have these things available for XYZ employees, without recognizing that there is an entire history of inequity that exists before that employee, I was going to say walks in your door, but virtually signs on to Zoom, I guess now is the right way to say that. But before that employee even starts with the company. And so to really do this work the right way, we need to acknowledge what has happened before these individuals were employees of the company. Acknowledging the systemic racism that exists, acknowledging the inequities that exist throughout our, the life cycle that is living in the United States or in other countries where these inequities exist, and saying, okay, if we really want to do this the right way, we need to, one, acknowledge that, and two, address them specifically. So I hear a lot of feedback of, mentorship programs. Well, let's roll out a mentorship program. Okay, super, let's roll out a mentorship program. But we need to identify exactly what type of mentorship program, who would benefit from it, how we should be pairing them, who should we make it available to, and also acknowledge the power structure that exists for people to raise their hands and say that they need that. So we can't be reliant on employees to say that they need this. We need to acknowledge it and then address it directly with them. So I'll say to our Black employees and recognizing that we do not have great representation of Black leadership at all. So we don't have internal mentors. So going to them and saying, hey, if you would like, we can offer this to you specifically for our Black employees, specifically for their experience, specifically to address what they go through as when it comes to imposter syndrome, self-fulfilling prophecy, whatever it is. So first acknowledging those differences and then saying, hey, a blanket solution won't work here, because I'll use the most represented group in tech, white males, they may feel super comfortable advocating for themselves. And so they're going to say, great, I'm going to have a mentor and we're going to, talk about doing XYZ that I'm already strong at. And I feel comfortable asking for that. No problem. Not looking at marginalized groups who don't feel comfortable advocating for themselves in the same way, and realize we need to take an extra step to help to give them that support that they've never had or have had in a much smaller amount than other groups have had. So I think it's really about, like I've said, acknowledging that the differences exist, not rolling out a blanket solution, acknowledging how the solution, once it's available to employees, will land for them, and what other support we can provide for employees to make sure that they are actually getting the most out of whatever opportunity we can provide for them.
Thank you. Shantae, let's talk again about retention a little further. Half of our surveyed employees who were considered other opportunities said they'd be more likely to stay if their employer improved on DEI. Not only like beyond what you're actually doing as an organization, how are you ensuring that employees believe in your commitment?
Yeah, great question. So I think for us last year, right, where most companies, right, the groundswell and the reckoning that was happening, right, my role was a direct output of all of that was going on in our company. So I think having transparency is really, really key to showing our employees' commitment. So that's transparency into our progress, not transparency to where we're not having progress, and really being open and honest and how our programs and initiatives are tracking. One thing that I keep saying, and I keep reminding myself, intention is great, but if it's not followed with action, it really falls flat and doesn't mean anything, right? And that's really, really important and key in diversity and inclusion and equity. And I think a big thing that I'm still getting used to, right, is seeking the feedback and the partnership, right? Being willing to go and ask and listen, and really trying to hear what is important to our employees, what is important to our ERGs, figuring out and working with our ERGs to figure out how we can work together to move our program and our strategy and goals forward, figuring out how to be strategic with my other people team leaders to really have programs and initiatives that support and tie to our overall D&I strategy and goals. And then I just think it's, you know, honesty and authenticity to our employees, right? Of how we're being successful and where we're not being successful, and really owning that and talking about it, and really being able to show how we're going to pivot. One of our values at Flatiron is start with why. So really being able to explain why we're doing something, but then the other side of that is really being able to explain why we're not doing something. So I think that level of transparency is really being able to show our commitment to our employees and being able to listen and feedback and show action to them.
I think that's spot on. Really, you know, asking for the feedback, but making sure you're seeing through. And if you can't commit to it, I'm like explaining through why. One question we're getting a ton of, and thanks everybody for submitting your questions through the Q&A function, is around metrics, right? So, you know, I think all of us in the HR world, it's easy to, you know, track down percentage of people, of applicants, percentage of, you know, people that we are hiring in specific roles in specific departments. What are other unique metrics, and I'll open it up to anybody on the panel, that you might be using that have been helpful in telling the story of DEI at your organizations?
I can start. I think it's really useful to look at both qualitative and quantitative metrics. Shantae mentioned really listening to employees and seeing how things track. So we look at our engagement surveys and we look at our data in terms of various cuts. So we don't look at it just in terms of, for example, just how all our employees think about whether they feel as though they belong. We also look at it in terms of how do our Black employees feel? How do our Black female employees feel? We look at it around really all the cuts of data that we can manage given the numbers that we have. So that's one aspect of it. Looking at exit interview data is useful. Attrition rates, again, looking at the data around all of these various cuts, especially the cuts that you're measuring for. So attrition, promotion, qualitative and quantitative data, really trying to hone in on where are the gaps, and really looking at it not just in terms of candidate pipeline, but also in terms of employee pipeline, because both of those tell really important stories that you might need to address.
I totally agree with everything that Sondra just said. I also think for us, we also do engagement survey, as you can see from my background, right in the midst of it. So yeah, looking at the cuts of data is really important. Within our engagement survey, we have questions on inclusion. So really using that data to drive a lot of the programs and initiatives that we end up rolling out the next year, which helps us really be keen to what our employees are saying and what's important to them. And again, not just guessing and using what we think is best, but really what our employees are saying and using the comments. There's a lot of interesting information and data in the comments. So really taking the time to go through that and see where we can do better, what's really important, what are some themes that are coming out with that. And one thing we want to try to do too, in particular on the inclusion piece as we think about our survey is, right, like based off those themes, how can we leverage the many D&I champions we have to support some of those things, right? So how can we leverage our ERGs and our D&I champions to support some of the things and themes that are coming out through those comments? And then the other thing I would say too is really using data and metrics to really drive performance of our processes and process improvement. So as you think about the interview pipeline and you think about performance rating, so really looking at those processes and looking at the data to do performance improvement for those key employee resources.
So yes to everything that both of you said. I'm not sure I can really add anything unique. At easycater, we do a DEI survey twice a year, and we have made the practice of publicizing our annual survey. We have not done it for the most recent year because of everything that has happened, but we are planning on publishing that data as well as 2020 at the same time. So 2019 and 2020 at the same time, if you go on the blog to look. So for us, I think what we have found is trying to think through employee experience. So in addition to everything, when we're asking about, I feel accepted being myself here, or, I feel easycater is a diverse workplace, we're really trying to gauge employee experience, collect the quantitative and the qualitative data, but also get down to the nitty gritty about what is your experience with your immediate team, with your manager, with your department, with the company. That's also been something that's been very helpful as we kind of slice and dice the data and look at it against all of our demographic data. Is where are our greatest opportunities? Where do we think we're doing great, but we're actually maybe not doing as great as we hope we were? And then feeding back on that data. So we do a report out, let people know what we plan on doing. And then every year we basically say, here's what we've done since then, and try to keep the story going and holding ourselves accountable and honest to what we said we would do. But also using that to show employees that we really are listening to what they're telling us and doing something about it. So kind of this great loop of actionable feedback, showing people what we're doing, but holding us accountable and making sure we're on the right path.
Perfect, thank you. I think Shante and Amaya just alluded a little bit to this. So usually HR owns DEI, right? Is that the right place? Is it internal? Should it be internal or external? And how do we avoid putting all of the burden on our marginalized employees and ERGs? Shante, I'd love to start with you on that one.
Great question. And it's so interesting. When I came into this role, I was talking with someone and we were talking about where does D&I fit? And this person said something really interesting to me, and I do agree with it. It doesn't, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter where it sits. What matters is, do you have the support from whoever it is you're reporting to advocate for you, to advocate for D&I, to remove blockers, and to help you move the program along. That can be sitting in and reporting directly to the CEO, but a lot of times the CEO may not have the bandwidth to have the level of engagement and involvement that you need to move some initiatives forward. So, sitting in HR may be appropriate. And then the other thing too is, you never want one organization or team to own D&I. It's not the responsibility of HR to own it only, or for me as head of D&I to own it only. It is across the organization and up and down the organization. And to be very transparent, as I came into this role from the business side, right, and being able to align passion, purpose, and job together, prior to taking on the role, I did think, oh, I'm going to own D&I, right? I'm going to do these things, move it forward, it's going to be great, all these things, speak on panels, and as you get in the role and learn, you don't want to be the only one owning it. One, you weren't the only one creating the challenges that are there, and you can't be the only one to solve it. Because if that's the case, you'll stay stagnant and nothing will happen. It has to be across the organization. So sitting in HR is the appropriate place. There are a lot of programs and initiatives that come out that come out of HR and for D&I, and Sonja talked about that earlier. But it's also being able to have some level of independence to also hold HR accountable as well. And so I think if you have that support from your leadership, it really doesn't matter where you sit. You need to sit where you can get the action done. And that could be in HR, it could be directly in the CEO, or it could be in another operations part of the organization.
Sonja, I want to take it over. Oh, go ahead, Amaya.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I completely agree with everything. And the one thing that I think is super important is it can live wherever, as long as it's being treated as a prioritized business initiative, the way we would treat any other prioritized business initiative, which means that it's led by subject matter experts, it's given a budget, and it's given resources. And so, Shante, to your point, talking about having it supported and being able to succeed, this is work. This is a job. This is work that needs to be done. And when it isn't prioritized in that way, it tends to fall on the marginalized employees that exist in the company, and then they end up kind of doing this work for free because they're either the ones who are passionate about it, the ones who are raising their hands, or kind of become the de facto, oh well, you're part of a marginalized group, so you must know how to do this work, which is wrong and unfair and shouldn't exist. And so wherever it lives, it needs to be treated the way we would treat anything else that is prioritized by the business. That's the only thing I would add.
No, that's a wonderful point. Thank you. I want to shift it a little bit to talk about leadership. And Sonja, this question's for you. Some leaders are silent on DEI because they don't want to say the wrong thing. So what advice would you give to people who hesitate to go public in support of DEI, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, or on any other critical movements?
So first of all, you are probably going to say the wrong thing. So I'm going to start there. You're going to say the wrong thing. So you need to just get over that. That should absolutely not stop you from being committed to this work. Plus one to what Shante and Amaya have said. Regardless of where this work sits, leadership needs to be involved, and the entire organization. And it's something that I say all the time. This work is very much a team of everyone being involved, and leadership therefore needs to be involved. And because of their unique role, they can advocate and they can really champion the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that might not be available to others. So the first thing that I would say is that should not stop you, but also recognize that anything you're saying, you should expect to be held accountable for, like anything else that you say in your role as a leader. So I would really encourage them to think about it as, if you're going to make a mistake, how do you use that as an opportunity to learn, right? To learn about the issues, to learn about the challenges, and to understand what are you going to action. Particularly over the last year, as the survey has shown, candidates and employees are demanding more, and they expect to see you do more. So I would encourage leaders not to say anything that they don't believe or that they don't intend to action. And part of being that sort of actionable, acting as an actionable ally in this work is learning about the issues. There are so many resources that are available that can meet you, whether you're just starting or you're a little more advanced. So learning about the issues, understanding that this did not happen overnight, and then thinking about it in the context of unpacking what's simple things. what's my privilege? What are the things that I had access to that others did not have access to? And how can I use my privilege in a way that benefits everyone? Really starting from that point, acknowledging that you might have to, as a leader, step back and create space for others to step forward and step up and to address it. But creating those pathways is some of the most important things that a leader can do. And I cannot emphasize how important it is to be able to create that space for others, but also to say and do things that you know you can stand behind. So that's the advice that I would have for any leader who is afraid. You cannot be afraid in doing this work. You have to step into it.
Thank you, Sandra. Yeah, the one thing I hope my company takes away from my time here is to learn the phrase, I'm sorry, I did not know that, and next time I'll do better, right? I think that's the best we can help coach people for. So,
And I think
Shante.
one thing about that, though, one thing I want to add on is there's a way to say sorry, right? And it's really using that as an opportunity to learn as opposed to, I'm sorry. No, it's really a place to step in and acknowledge, okay, how could I have done this better for the next time? And I think that approaching it with that sort of curiosity and opportunity to learn is where we really want to see everyone step into.
I love that. Thank you. Shante, on this topic of leadership, one of the challenges, and I think we're seeing a lot of questions from our audience on this, is around buy-in, right? So how do we achieve buy-in on DEI? Can you advise, people here with us today who can't get buy-in or who don't feel it's safe to raise their voices? What approach would you take in their situation?
Great question, and what we are experiencing across the organization as well. I think for me, as I am learning myself in this role and on how to gain buy-in and what I think is important for the program and where I would like to see us go, right, is really being able to, like I said earlier, I think listening is really important. So like for me, it was about going on listening tours in this role, right? Like coming in and really being able to listen and see what's important. Also really listening to our leaders, like, and trying to meet people where they're at, right? Like I don't need everyone to be an exec sponsor for employees resource group. I don't need everyone to be out there working with our recruiting and speaking at events, but let me figure out where you're at and let's try to meet where you're at and see how we can grow and see what's really important and specific to you and your team, right? I think Amaya was saying earlier, or Sandra, that there's not a one size fits all, right? For a D&I program, there's not a one size fits all for a D&I leader and for leaders within your organization as well. So really trying to meet people where they're at on their own personal journey, and then where they're at can actually support our overall D&I program. By no means is that perfect, but that's kind of one of the tactics and tools that has helped me in this role. And then I think a big place is really trying to work with our HRBPs to really find a way to have space for people to really have meaningful, impactful conversation if it's something that they choose to, right? So how can we create this space to have very uncomfortable conversations, get people being used to being uncomfortable and feeling uncomfortable, and that's okay, and how we can push through and move past and come out the other side. But then also, in this role, and I'm always mindful and reminding myself, it's also having space for people to be like, I'm not ready to talk about this. I also need to have space for people to be like, I'm not ready to talk about this and I'm not comfortable with it, right? And that is okay too, right? So how do we have that space, but also have a place where people can go to if they do want to have these conversations, and also a resource for people to be, I don't know the answer, but here is where you can find it. Here's where we can find it together. So we're constantly working through this at Flatiron. By no means do we have the right answer yet, but those are just some of the things we're trying to tackle and to really show partnership and try to get the buy-in early.
Thank you. Sandra, Shante just touched on a little bit about having those conversations. So what advice would you share for people who want to open and lead company-wide conversations or trainings about discrimination, identity in the workplace, or similar DEI topics? What do you think are the best practices for these?
Sure. So at Asana, we do a couple of things that I think that might be really useful for other organizations. We do, from the time someone joins the organization as part of their onboarding, I do onboarding sessions about diversity and inclusion. And I'm really clear that some of the conversations, this might be the first time you're hearing this, might be uncomfortable. But my aim is to, as Shante said, really try to help you understand why this matters to us as an organization and the work that we're doing. So they're really clear that this is our approach from the start, as well as how it aligns to the values that we have as an organization. We also host a Real Talk internal series where we have conversations about all of the things that are happening. And we involve leadership in those conversations, not as participants, but really we encourage them to attend, because I think it's really important for them to hear and understand the issues and challenges that other employees are facing within the organization. I'm really clear. So we have conversations that have ranged from being Black in tech, to being a Muslim in America, to being an immigrant to America, to being biracial, to coming out, a variety of discussions. And I'm really clear that these are Asanas not speaking for the entire identity. They are sharing their perspectives and really sharing it as a way for others in the organization to understand the challenges that might exist outside of the workplace and how it affects how they show up, or how it impacts how they show up. And it's really about having people come to these discussions to learn, to listen, to understand. And we have a call to action in terms of really reflecting on what can you do? What can you approach differently? I think it's really clear that we want people to come away not with feeling sympathetic, but with a sense of empathy, understanding how or stepping into someone else's shoes so that they can then understand how they can go forward. I think approaching it like that is a way that gets people into a space where it is uncomfortable. Having a discussion about white fragility and allyship is an uncomfortable discussion, but encouraging people to participate and to go through it, I think just benefits everyone. So I would encourage people to perhaps use that as an opportunity to learn and to understand, and then to reflect.
Thank you so much. I'm mindful of time. I wish we had 3 more hours to talk here, but probably have time for just a couple more questions. So we've gotten some questions in the chat about ageism, and we mentioned that earlier. So let's dig into that for a little bit here. Amaya, this question's for you. 94% of companies surveyed said that less than a quarter of their employees are aged 46 to 55. What more must be done to retain employees in this age group? And more than that, what can be done to nurture them? I ask a bit of a leading question, also, why should we?
The why, it's so interesting, because the why should we, to me, it's I know people are still wondering this, but it's because they are humans, and by the nature of existing, they deserve to be treated equitably, to be accepted for who they are, regardless of age, gender, any part of their identity. And so absolutely we should, because it is the right thing to do, the way that we are doing this work for any other marginalized group. So that to me is the moral call to action of course we should be doing this. We should be paying attention to this. I think so tech companies or startup companies tend to be kind of homogenous in their makeup, right? Like male, Paleonial, white, young, demographic, right? As we're talking about throughout this report that Built-in put out, and what I think all of our lived experiences are. And so when we think about the makeup of a group and what their experiences are, what conversations are going to exist, what topics they're going to be talking about, what they did on the weekends, these things that when you're talking, the water cooler conversations, this is where I get a lot of feedbacks to where our older employees are feeling like they're not welcome in the topics of discussion, maybe their political views, what they're doing on the weekends, they have families. The conversations tend to be more towards younger activities, and they feel uncomfortable and excluded and not welcome for that. That's one place where I'm seeing it happen. I'm also seeing it happen in the interview process, where the move fast and break things is a big thing, I think, in the tech world. And so we have it in our minds that, you know, moving fast equals young, equals agile, equals, and these are all synonymous, which is incorrect, right? So I think first we have to acknowledge where the biases are popping in. They're popping in when we're evaluating candidates. They're also creeping in how our employees are communicating and interacting at work. And what can we do to address that? So I think we treat this the same way that we would treat any other group being marginalized, in saying, okay, how can we make the process more equitable? Identifying, Sanjay or Shantae, I'm not sure, I apologize, but one of you mentioned earlier, being really clear as to what we mean when we say adding or fitting to the culture, being really clear when we say what we're looking for in a role. What does success in this role look like? And that we're not attributing that to any one person, but we're attributing that to behaviors that are demonstrated, to actions that are demonstrated. So the same way we'd address equity with any other group, we need to be addressing it here. And then I think internally, not ignoring this one group because they, you know, are maybe made up of more white people or more men or whatever it is, and they also happen to be older adults, but recognizing that being older is also a marginalized group. And so what can we do to make our older employees feel more included and feel comfortable being at work, and addressing it like a real and a valid experience. I think that's another thing that I hear is more of like the eye roll, like, you know, I'm saying this like cringing where, oh, and I'm going to mess this up. Like what's the boomer? Like there's like a term that people are saying now about the older generation, like, oh, the boomers this or boomer that. And recognizing that's a microaggression. That's a way of making people feel uncomfortable in a space. And so what can we do to talk to our employees, to educate them about that, to make them aware of what behaviors can exclude a group? And not just ignore it because it's not the group we think of when we think of DEI.
Thank you. And again, we probably have time for one last question. I'll open up to anybody here. One of the things that's come up a little bit in the chat and our questions too is similar to the ageist conversation. How are we identifying, you know, those other underrepresented groups? You know, for example, Indigenous groups, people of color, intersectionality, you know, parents, veterans, all these other groups. I'd love to hear from anyone on the panel. You know, how have you addressed issues for those other underrepresented populations in your organizations?
I can start. Part of it is, again, going back to the data, understanding who's at your organization, recognizing that people might have one identity that's their primary identity, but certainly there's intersectionality. Particularly over the last year, we focused on parents and caregivers because we recognize that they have unique challenges. So how are you creating resources that support them? Whether it's awareness, whether it's around having discussions about the very real challenges that they have, but it's also about thinking about how can you ensure that they can feel comfortable expressing the challenges that they have to their teammates, right? So really creating those spaces, again, where it's around awareness, where it's around learning, but it's also around what can the organization do to support. So as a quick example, around parents and caregivers, we thought about it in terms of really normalizing setting times, work times, being clear on, I need to take time to do something, I need to be offline, and having and asking leaders to model that behavior, because it's not just for the obvious parent, but certainly it can apply to a caregiver who can be caring for anyone, right? So really encouraging people to model that behavior and not have it be thought of as something that only applies to a particular group. And the same thing applies to, again, looking at the data, checking in on how members from different groups are coping with anything, really creating that space where people feel comfortable raising their hand and saying, this is what's happening to me, this is how I feel, and being able to address it.
I think that's, yeah, spot on. And I think really Sanja's point of listening to and understanding your employees is really important, and really providing that voice and that space for them to raise their hand. I think for us, I'm really excited this year. We have like two new ERGs kicking off. And so one of them is for disability. And so really, it was really hearing from our employees and supporting them. And I think also from the last year, them seeing the advocacy and the work that the other ERGs were doing. And so really being able to provide that space for all to kind of come and be a part of it and really see how they can actually move on diversity and inclusion forward for our disability, for our employees that have disabilities, is really exciting to see and to see that kind of come to fruition. So I think really understanding that employee population is important and having the space for them to raise their hand and to come forward.
All right. So with that, I think it's time to wrap up our conversation. Thank you everybody in our audience for being so engaged. As I said before, I think we could have talked for hours based on the amount of questions that came in. Thank you to our panelists for sharing their advice and approaches. Just a closing note too, at Built-in, we've been working hard to provide our community with resources to prepare now to grow and thrive in the future. After the event, look for the full report of our first state of DEI in tech. And then please complete our survey so we can continue to improve on our webinars and content. We had a lot of questions come in specifically about gender equality and equity. We didn't get to answer them all, but look out for information on our next webinar, which is in March, featuring women in tech. We look forward to that conversation again. Again, Shante, Amaya, and Sanja, thank you so much for your time today. And with that, have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.